ColeyDoesThings presents Losing My Shit over the Magnus Archives for God knows how many minutes.
Finally, the perfect time to talk about one of my most recent favorite fixations. Guys, let's have a little chat about something called the Magnus Archives. So I first heard about the Magnus Archives a while ago on Tumblr. People were saying, you gotta listen to the Magnus Archives. The Magnus Archives is so good, give it a try. If you love spooky shit, then the Magnus Archives is for you. And in true, I don't want to check this thing out because I know I'm gonna lose years of my life to this piece of media fashion. I did not listen to this podcast for a good few years. And also because I knew it was a horror podcast, and I was like, okay, but how scary does it actually get? Because I'm a little antsy about horror. But earlier this year, I finally bit the bullet and gave it a shot, and like Melanie King, it lodged itself into my flesh and rotted me from the inside out. You'll understand that reference later if you listen to the podcast. So, what is the Magnus Archives? Or TMA, as it's also known as. TMA sounds like TMI. We could spin it to mean too many avatars. There's just so many, what the f***? The Magnus Archives
is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com.
Is a horror podcast centered around the character Jonathan Sims, John, who finds himself in a new job position as the head archivist of the Magnus Institute, a research institution dedicated to digging into all things paranormal, esoteric, and unexplained. They make the very clear distinction that they're not paranormal investigators. They're researchers, academics, and they take their job very seriously. John gets his new job after the old head archivist, Gertrude Robinson, mysteriously perishes on the job, and the details on that are a bit fuzzy for a while. A big part of John's job description is that he needs to take statements from people who come to the Magnus Institute and recount their spooky experiences. And some of those paranormal experiences and sinister happenings refuse to be recorded on regular technology, and so John has to whip out an old tape recorder and record them through that. It's the only thing that works. And that's the format of this podcast. These statements recorded on a tape recorder by John, who's narrating and commenting on them. And because the Magnus Institute is literally centuries old, people have been coming in for a long time to recount their scary stories, and so much of the statements have just been written down and submitted, so it's now John's job to also find those guys, record them on the tape recorder so they could be properly organized. John has 3 assistants to help him follow up on leads from the statements or research them further. There's Tim, Sasha, and Martin, but John doesn't really count Martin a lot of the time because he's kind of a hot mess, but then we also have Tim, who's a hot mess. And then Sasha, the most qualified of them all, God bless her. Initially, the series feels more like an anthology, a collection of scary stories. Like, tune in next week to hear a new story that'll make it hard for you to fall asleep. But gradually, things start kind of clicking and falling into place, and the story that's been building in the background really takes center stage and hits the ground running by the end of season 1. There's 5 seasons total. The first season is kind of laying down the groundwork for everything and getting you accustomed to the Magnus Institute and the players involved. Season 2 is when John loses his shit.
Be careful. No more impetuous subterranean adventures, understand?
Of course. Supplemental. I'm in the tunnels I was exploring and I got lost.
Season 3 is when the story really picks up and takes center stage. Season 4 is kind of like all over the place and when a lot of the bigger stuff starts to build up. And season 5 is the grand finale. That's all I can really say without getting too spoilery with it. I remember the first time I listened to the Magnus Archives was when I was packing up some candles late at night, and probably not the wisest choice for someone who's better with horror in theory rather than in practice. Like, I love reading about horror, especially eldritch and cosmic horror. That's my favorite flavor of it. But in terms of actually, like, experiencing it in the form of stories and movies and whatnot, I can be a bit of a weenie about it. I have an overactive imagination, okay? Like, a lot of my experience with the Magnus Archives has just been, whoa, this is so freaky and creepy and cool. I love these characters so much. And then me hiding under my blankets an hour later, like, But by the way, if you're in the same boat and you don't want to re-listen to a lot of the statements because they just creep you out so much, someone was kind enough to basically post the entire series without the statements and just the story bits on YouTube if you want to listen to that. Now, one of the biggest draws of the Magnus Archives that people have really latched onto and love is something called the fears. I think it's super clever and really enjoy it myself, but we are going to get into slight spoiler territory. I won't go too in depth and we'll keep it pretty general, but if you'd rather learn about the fears on your own by listening to the podcast and you don't want to get spoiled, then skip over this part. So it turns out that all of the spooky happenings that have been occurring throughout the story, all of the stuff that's been talked about in the statements on the tape recorders and have been wrecking chaos on the characters, have been because of these forces called the fears. The fears are, to put it simply, our fear, manifested by and manifesting everything we're afraid of and existing just outside of our dimension. As beings, they can't quite exist in our world as it is, so in order to exist and feed, they need to push their sphere of influence in our world and generate fear in order to survive. And they can do this by infecting or leeching into or manifesting as objects or people, avatars. Avatars are typically living beings that have been touched by one of these fears and are now a part of them. And so in order for them to survive, they need to feed their fear patron, but in exchange, they are granted some of their fear patron's powers and abilities. And which powers and abilities they get depend on which aspect of fear they're aligned to. And of all the things we're afraid of in the world, they can be boiled down into 14 separate fear entities, 15 later on. And you might be thinking, well, there's a lot more than just 15 things humanity's afraid of. And to that I say, think less literally and more metaphorically and symbolically, and you'll find that a lot of the shit out there falls pretty cleanly in this list of 15. Like, it's scary how well this works. The 15 fear entities are the buried, the corruption, the dark, the desolation, the end, the eye, the flesh, the hunt, the lonely, the slaughter, the spiral, the stranger, the vast, the web, and the extinction. Plucking these descriptions right out of the Magnus Archives Wikipedia, the buried is essentially claustrophobia manifested in many different forms. There's the literal sense of being buried, like the fear of being buried alive, or claustrophobia, being in a space that's too tight, the fear of suffocating or drowning, and the feeling of walls closing in on you, so much so that you can't breathe. But it can also take the form of the fear of financial issues, of being buried under debt, the fear of having all your options cut off with nowhere to go. Everything crashing and crumbling around you and you just can't move. It can take the form of caves, dirt, financial issues, heavy rain, underground transport like subways, or tight places like crawl spaces or coffins. The corruption is basically the fear of anything that makes your skin crawl, that makes you feel disgust or grossed out. Think bugs, filth, disease, infection, whatever can make your stomach turn and make you feel queasy. If you have trypophobia, this is your worst nightmare. It can manifest as mold, mildew, bugs, rot, decay. But what's really interesting is that it can also manifest as unhealthy relationships, toxic love, so to speak. The fact that it's also known as the crawling rot or flesh hive speaks for itself. The dark is pretty self-explanatory. It's the fear of the dark, or rather being in darkness and you're not sure if there's something else there with you. It's one of the oldest, most primal fears out there, which makes sense. The fear of the unseen, of creatures hiding from our view, and it can manifest as creatures hidden in the dark, shadow figures and monsters, coldness, blindness, and dark water. It can also take the metaphorical form of being in the dark about something, secrets being kept from you. The desolation is the fear of pain, loss, and destruction for no reason at all, of potential being snuffed out before it can blossom, just things and people being taken away senselessly. Think like your house burning down with all of your worldly possessions and heirlooms in there, or the burning of the Library of Alexandria, all of that knowledge which could have expanded our minds and done so much good, lost forever. It's also known as the lightless flame, the torturing flame, the devastation, the blackened earth, and the ravaging burn. A lot of fire imagery. The end is the fear of death, the fate that waits for and eventually takes us all. While it might be natural, expected, and a known truth, it doesn't mean we're not afraid of it. It's the fear that everything, no matter how old or withstanding, will end eventually. It can manifest as bones, corpses, skeletons, mummies, zombies, and is also linked to dreams. The end is also known as death, terminus, the termination of all life, and the coming end that waits for all and cannot be ignored. The eye is the fear of being watched, of having your secrets exposed, of being followed, stalked, and also the desire to learn too much, even if it destroys you in the end. The notion of something just watching you suffer and doing nothing about it. Imagine you're surrounded by a circle of people, and no matter how much you beg, plead, cry for help, all they do is stare at you. The eye can manifest as eyes, of course, security cameras, surveillance, anything that embodies constant watch, and it can also manifest in libraries and books. You have to know and see things just for the sake of it. You know too much to the extreme. Curiosity killed the cat. The flesh is the fear of gore, of viscera, anything to deal with body horror, really. Think factory farms and slaughterhouses to the extreme. It's one of the newer fear entities, born from the fear of animals bred for their meat, as well as the human realization that we're all just animated meat and bones, and it can manifest as meat, corpses, blood, bones, butchers, anything related to the meat industry, and it came about around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Body yaddy 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 in the worst way possible. The hunt is one of the oldest fears, and it's the fear of being prey, of being hunted down and chased. It can manifest as predatory animals, monsters, animal instincts, animalistic traits, just anything that reads feral. It's the thrill of the chase, of tracking something down and pouncing, and it's also simply known as the blood. The lonely is the fear of being alone, of loneliness and isolation, feeling like you're all by yourself on an island, even if you're surrounded by people. It's the fear of being completely cut off and disconnected from the rest of society, and it can manifest as fog, silence, suburbs, large rooms, empty rooms, or crowds full of faceless people. No matter what you do, no matter how loud you scream, you're just alone. It's also known as Forsaken or the One Alone. The slaughter is the fear of unpredictable, unmotivated violence, of pain hitting you randomly, suddenly. It could be anything from a serial killer to soldiers in a war. It can manifest as people driven mad with slaughter, soldiers, music that induces mania, murder, just pure violence in any form. Think fighting, struggle, and you don't know what's gonna happen next. The spiral is the fear of madness, of lying, deception, of your mind and senses being wrong. You can't trust what you see. Everything you know is twisted somehow. You know something is off, but maybe you can't quite put your finger on it, or no one believes you. The spiral can manifest as spirals, patterns and fractals, hallucinations, illusions. Think impossible geometry, puzzles, or mazes. It can also take the form of gaslighting. The Winchester Mystery House, with the staircases that go up to the ceiling and the doors that lead to nowhere, is a good picture of what the spiral could be. It's also known as It Lies, the twisting deceit, and it's not what it is. The stranger is the fear of the unknown, the unfamiliar, and the uncanny valley. Think you're interacting with something or someone, but they don't feel right, and you get this creeping sense that something is wrong and the hairs at the back of your neck stand up. Anything really that doesn't look, sound, smell, or feel like it's supposed to. A portrait of someone, but their features don't match their face. A statue with the eyes looking a little too human. Or something about a stranger on the street that just rubs you the wrong way. It can manifest as dolls, mannequins, wax figures, masks, and taxidermy, and is associated with theaters and performances. It's also known as I Do Not Know You. The vast is the fear of too much space, to the point where you're infinitesimal. The finite becoming infinite. It's the fear of falling, of heights, of being in outer space, being in the open ocean or deep water. It's the human fear of insignificance and meaningless, of losing yourself in just too much of everything. It can manifest as a void, wide open spaces, vertigo, falling, and of all limits being removed. We're so small in the grand scale of the universe that nothing matters. Think skydiving with nothing but the sky, clouds, and the feeling of falling forever. The web is the fear of being controlled, manipulated, or trapped. The fear of being forced to do things against your will, or the fear of being unaware of your own entrapment. Imagine you're a sim in some twisted god's game, and you can't do anything to stop it. It's the fear that you're at the mercy of destiny, of fate, and you have no say no matter how hard you try. Maybe you're you're afraid of the power your parents, your boss, or other people in your life have over you. Something's pulling at your strings behind the scenes, but you can't take a look at what's behind the curtain. And it's also the fear of spiders. It can manifest as spiders, spider webs, web-like patterns, or puppets. And it's also known as the spider, the great spider, mother of puppets, the mother, the spinner of schemes, and the hidden machination. And finally, the youngest fear is the extinction. The fear of catastrophic change, destruction of nature, destruction of humanity as we know it, all of this being attributed to mankind's own undoing. Any sort of imagery from whatever post-apocalyptic movie you like. It can manifest as human technology, like computers, code, and radio, and seems to present horrifying visions of what humanity could become. It's also known as the terrible change, the future without us, and the world is always ending. I do want to note that the fear entities are not cleanly separated beings. They overlap with each other. Infinite fears can be grouped into a few categories. Each entity can be separated to some degree, but the fears bleed and feed into one another around the edges. And within each entity are different shades of the same hue. For instance, the stranger and the spiral have a lot of overlap with each other. They both deal with things not being quite right. The lonely and the I can be closely intertwined. I mean, it's a lot scarier when you know just how alone you are. The devastation, the slaughter, and the flesh can all manifest in war, and the dark can play with both the buried and the vast. The fears are this amorphous blob thinly separated from each other, like colors, but if colors hated you. If you want to share your favorite fear, the one you're the most attuned to, as well as the fear that you're the most afraid of, then feel free to do so in the comments. Me personally, I get a kick out of the spiral. It could be fun. The stranger's also pretty cool because I love dolls, and I don't know, the Uncanny Valley stuff, like, it's super creepy, but I kind of like it in a weird way. And then the I could also work because I need to know way too much constantly. I fall under that spell. But in terms of fears that, like, I could not deal with, it would be the buried because I get claustrophobic and, like, the idea of not having enough room to breathe, and then the corruption because it's just nasty stuff. Like, would you still love me if I was a worm? No, not those worms, honey. Sorry. Now for the fandom. There's quite a few statements that are kind of notorious in the fandom, like Lost John's Cave. I cannot re-listen to that one no matter how hard I try. There's Binary, a guest from Mr. Spider. The blanket one, where it's like the blanket never did anything. Depending on what you're most afraid of, different statements will hit differently. Like a statement I might find to be tame and be like, oh, it's more strange than anything else, could be someone else's worst nightmare. Can I just say that I love how our main character who's taking us through this horrific story is this pathetic wet cat of a man. He is scrunkly, pooky, a little meow meow. He tries so hard to be skeptical and serious at the beginning of the story, and then it quickly just disintegrates like a wet paper towel. Something that I think John really needs to hear throughout his entire journey is, it's you. Despite everything, it's still you. Or is it? ... I always find it really fascinating how fans come together and collectively decide on a design for characters in mediums like podcasts where their descriptions aren't super stated or obvious or even really touched upon. The fandom was like, alright, this is Jonathan Sims, everybody. Prototype Bruno Madrigal. He's also canonically asexual, so for all the aces out there, bon appetit. Is it weird that being a head archivist of a paranormal research institution would be like a dream job for me? I mean, not like at the Magnus Institute, obviously, but like in an alternate reality where the fears weren't a thing. What's really funny is that the creator of the Magnus Archives is Jonathan Sims, who also voices Jonathan Sims. One of my personal favorite characters is Basira. I really connect to her personal mantra of there's always two options in whatever you're doing, either accept where you are or do something to change it. And then we get to the fandom's favorite minor side character, Jerry, our favorite book-burning goth with mommy issues and a bad dye job. He's quite fun to play around with, and because he's not super duper fleshed out in the main story, the fandom has taken that and ran. His voice is really nice too, I have to give him that. It's so funny how many side characters blip up every now and then and maybe have a grand total of like 2 minutes of screen time, and they have such dedicated fan bases. Like, they're truly the glup of this podcast. Why are there so many Michaels, and then good old Elias, our king of bureaucracy. Really amusing how the fandom has turned him into this fabulously dressed stoner. For ships, we do have some canonical gay pairings. If you don't want to get spoiled, then skip over this section. John and Martin get together, and not gonna lie, it took me some time to get kind of like into the pairing. I was like, oh, I mean, I don't hate it, but I'm not like, super zazzed about it. I'm like, okay, cute. Moving on with the horrors. But after I fell more into it, I was like, oh, this is really cute. Can't believe their f***ing ship name is J-Mart, of all things. Like, we've got plenty of other really creative ship names in the fandom, but for the main couple, not just J-Mart. We've also got Melanie and Georgie, our influencer couple. Lonely Eyes is a really funny pairing. It's between Elias Bouchard and Peter Lucas. I can't say I'm like a serious shipper of it. I think it's more like silly than anything else, but I'll still read fics about it, and at least in fanon, I think it works. I really love Tim and Sasha together too. Like, they're such a bi for pi couple. But dude, the pairing that kind of like knocked me off my feet and caught me really off guard was Dorky. The pairing between Michael Distortion and Gerard Key, Jerry. Dorky! It's such a cute name! The timeline does not work, it makes little to no sense, but god damn it, they look good together, so I'm shipping it. In theory, their potential together could be fantastic, and that's what I'm rolling with. I have seen some back and forth about Dorky, but I'm just gonna enjoy my monster door and goth boyfriends in the corner, if that's cool. I really enjoy all the fan content where we get to see John and Jerry be besties and go monster and Lightner hunting together across the US. Wish we got more of it. I might have to take it into my own hands. There are several fandom inside jokes, of course, from the infamous Jürgen Lightner audio, which was taken from a Discord message.
Jürgen Lightner? Stupid idiot motherfucking Jürgen Lightner. Goddamn fool, book collecting, dust eating, rat old bastard, shithead idiot avatar of the whore.
To Hans McMike, I want another divorce.
Hello, John. Apologies for the deception, but
The homophobic vase, kayaking with Tim, twinkifying every monster out there to become utterly f***able. I mean, in my opinion, it could have just stuck with the original form, but a lot of the fanfics in this fandom tend to be either fix-its or alternate canons, or AUs where everybody lives and no one dies, or this one thing was changed and so now everything is different. I have noticed a lot of fantasy AUs too, where like John is a recluse or a sorcerer and Martin kind of comes to him as like a knight or some sort of warrior or peacemaker. Another fic trope I really enjoy for this fandom is John and Martin retiring to the countryside with John becoming a teacher. Gotta love that domestic fluff. Time travel shenanigans where later season characters go back to season 1 and try to fix things or advise their younger selves. A lot of stuff pointing to the fans just really not being okay, because a lot of does go down. And don't even get me started on the animatics this fandom has produced, guys. Holy f***ing shit. Like, I remember I watched some of them right as I was getting into the Magnus archives, and going back and rewatching them, it's like, oh my god, I can recognize all these things I didn't notice before and pick up on these little details, and holy shit, this is a masterpiece! The links to some of my favorites will be in the description, and hopefully they entice you to give the podcast a shot if you're on the fence about it. What's crazy is that several audio clips from the Magnus archives actually went viral on TikTok and Shorts and Instagram.
you don't sound Russian?
How could I sound anything, silly? I'm plastic. I don't even have a voice box. I had to borrow this one. Don't turn on the light.
And people were like, where the f*** is this from? I'm like, holy shit, the Magnus Archives is going viral! And that, I think, brought in a new influx of listeners, too. Lord knows how many people watched those animatics and were like, I need to know who these people are. Who is this little guy who looks like he's having the worst time imaginable? Fine, I'll listen to the Magnus Archives. God! There have been a lot of really creative cosplays, too. Like, in general, guys, this fandom has been a blast to be a part of, but I think that's partially because I came in so late, and so I think a lot of the hype and kind of the mania for it died down a hot second ago, so now I'm like, what's up guys, late to the party, oh all you can eat buffet, don't mind if I do. Now, the Magnus Archives does have a lot of the same vibes and appeal as other spooky, supernatural adjacent, paranormal-esque media out there that is big in fandom spaces. If you were a Tumblrina back in the 2010s, or just know your Tumblr history, then you've likely heard of Welcome to Night Vale, a podcast that debuted in 2012 and just took the website over by storm. All hail the glow cloud, yada yada yada. It took the form of a radio show hosted by a man called Cecil Palmer that covered all the happenings of a town called Night Vale. It was very surrealist, absurdist, nothing really made sense, but it was this really quirky, not too spooky brand of horror that people really enjoyed, and Cecil Palmer, of course, became a Tumblr sexy man. Because it's an audio-only format, there were lots of different interpretations of what Cecil looked like, and there still are, but a lot of people tend to gravitate towards this design of him. Tall, blonde, white guy, dapperly dressed, with lots of eyes and tentacles sometimes. Peak Tumblr. And when the Magnus Archives came out about 4 years later, it kind of presented itself as like, Welcome to Night Vale's spookier, darker, grittier, greener cousin, with a lot more emphasis on the horror aspects that Welcome to Night Vale tend to spin in a more wacky direction. Like, they're both plenty wacky, but whereas Welcome to Night Vale's wackiness is more so along the lines of wackiness for weirdness sake, the Magnus Archives wackiness just falls under straight up horror. The stuff that will haunt your dreams, literally. Like, I'm sorry Glow Cloud, my beloved, but you can never strike as much fear in my heart as the name Jürgen Leitner does. It's interesting. I want to make like some sort of diagram, like a Venn diagram or a triangle, just depicting the similarities and differences between the Magnus Archives, Welcome to Night Vale, and Gravity Falls. Comparing them, seeing where they overlap, the biggest contrasts, and then I want to make a crossover of all three. And hey, if there's any other pieces of media that you think belong in the ring with those three, then let me know in the comments. I guess I could technically throw Supernatural in there. But do I want to? Now, a sequel to the Magnus Archives came out recently called the Magnus Protocol, which is kind of like an AU of the original, where the Magnus Institute burned down, and now it's taking place in a different timeline. I have not listened to it in full yet, although I have heard clips, I've seen plenty of the memes, so that will be my next project to tackle, and season 1 just ended, so time to binge it. Now, as for why the Magnus Archives is so intriguing in general, for one, the sort of atmosphere it creates with the sound design and the voice work and the music is incredible. Very immersive, you're always at the edge of your seat. Really though, it speaks to how and why we're afraid of what we're afraid of, and what we consequently do with that fear, how we handle it, how we let it interact with the people around us. Jerry says so himself, some people just have a weird relationship with fear. If you're a fan of the Twilight Zone, of Lovecraftian horror, if you love symbolism and metaphors sprinkled in with your mysteries, or looking deeper into folklore and spooky stories, or if you just love good storytelling, the Magnus Archives is for you. And that, I think, is what I'm going to leave you with. For those of you who've wanted me to make a Magnus Archives video for forever, I hope this scratched the itch for you. I definitely want to talk more about it, especially after I finish the Magnus Protocol, so look forward to that. I even bought the Magnus Archives RPG, which I'm super excited to give a whirl. And if you've never heard of the Magnus Archives until now, or you just never listened to it, do you think you're gonna give it a go now? If you're a big TMA fan, who's your favorite character, your favorite season, your favorite ship, your favorite statement? I'll leave links to the first few episodes in the description for anyone who's curious, and if you do try, then let me know what you thought of it in the comments. As always, if you'd like to see more fandom and fan culture-esque videos from yours truly, then feel free to subscribe, and if you'd like to see my personal fanfiction recommendation list with over 8,000 fics on there, as well as exclusive videos not on YouTube, then check out my Patreon or YouTube memberships. And thank you so much for watching, everybody. I will see you in my next video. Bye!
안녕.